Okay, today I'd like to explore with you the world of non-democracies, authoritarian regimes, dictatorships, whatever. What are they really and how do they work? Are some dictatorships better than others? And can dictatorship be better than democracy? Well, let's talk about it. I'm Professor Michael Wolf, and this is Comparative Politics Online. Okay, the thing about all non-democratic regimes is this. Rulers are not institutionally accountable to the majority of those they rule. It doesn't mean that they're all powerful and they can do whatever they want without consequence. It just means that common people like us have no legal means to say no if we don't like what a ruler is doing. And generally, we have little or no say in what policy decisions are being made in the first place. Okay, but get this, it doesn't mean that people in a dictatorship won't still believe that they are free and that in fact they are living in a democracy. Now, if you travel to a country today that is broadly considered to be non-democratic, and let's think about the example of Vietnam, all right? You probably won't be able to tell the difference if you go travel there. Vietnamese citizens are likely to identify their own country as democratic, even when Western political scientists say no way. And when you go there, you'll probably be able to move just as freely through the countryside as you would if you were in France or Belgium, which are both countries deemed to be fully democratic by political scientists. Now, the difference is that in a country like Vietnam, the political system only allows for the existence of one political party. That's the Communist Party. So there is no party competition, so to speak. And this fundamentally limits the range of political choice there. But there is still representation and there's still elections. And people are still allowed to travel around the country and they're allowed to buy and sell things more or less as they please. So for the average citizen, that system probably seems democratic and free enough. And why not? I mean, how much more choice do we really have in the United States where just two political parties share the national monopoly on representation? But that's besides the point. Let's get back to the question of accountability and the problems as well as the advantages of a state that is not accountable to the larger public. Now, if you ask me, and especially if you ask the famous political scientist James C. Scott, who I highly recommend, what the main problem is, it's this. Rulers see the world in a fundamentally different way than the people being ruled. And if they're not held accountable for how they wield their power, eventually they're going to make decisions for the sake of preserving state power that may well prove catastrophic to the populations they rule over. Take Joseph Stalin, for example, whose policies of collectivization of agriculture, forced migration, and communist orthodoxy in general led to the starvation of millions of people, also to cultural erasure and to mass imprisonment. Or look at Mao Zedong, whose signature industrialization plan in 1959, known as the Great Leap Forward, caused as many as 30 million people to die of hunger. Now, these are worst case scenarios, of course, but a lack of institutional accountability can open the door to terrible abuses of power anywhere, and to any degree. In Argentina, between 1976 and 1982, for instance, a military junta there killed or disappeared an estimated 30,000 people, often subjecting them to terrible forms of torture and even throwing them out of airplanes into the Atlantic Ocean while they were still alive. Then there's the more insidious stuff of dictatorship. China today may have a competitive advantage in the economic realm because the ruling party has a monopoly of power there. That is, it can lay train tracks or authorize development projects wherever it wants, whenever it wants, without concern for those who might object. But those who object simply have to swallow it. Well, if the government wants to flood your town to build a dam, too bad. They're the state. Oh, the government thinks your ethnic group or religion is a threat to national security? Might be time for a re-education camp for you, bud. The point is, if there is no institutional accountability and there's no real electoral competition, there simply cannot really be a rule of law. There's no guarantee that the state won't one day stomp its big leather boot right on the back of your neck tell you to just admit it, that 2 plus 2 really equals 5. Well, and if you want to complain or disagree, there's always the gallows, mon frère. Okay, however, as I said earlier, being a dictator is not about being all powerful. In fact, as a dictator, getting your subjects to obey you and to refrain from trying to overthrow you is tricky business. At the end of the day, if you want to be a successful dictator, you simply have to solve 2 pretty complicated problems. The first is to get other elites like you to invest in your regime and help you run the state. And to achieve this, you're going to need to give something to them in return for their loyalty. We'll call this power sharing. And the second problem concerns the masses. How can you get millions of people to acquiesce to your rule and not rebel against you? Well, it's going to be a mix of carrots and sticks. And of course, a healthy sprinkling of propaganda can't hurt either. We're going to call this population control. And as with power sharing, there are a lot of different ways to do it. Generally speaking, the specific combination of strategies for power sharing and population control will determine just what kind of authoritarian regime you're presiding over. And it may determine how stable your regime is too. Now, let's start looking at different types of non-democratic regimes through this lens of power sharing and population control. And as we do, I want you to ask yourself this question. First, forget about democracy for a moment. It doesn't exist. If you were to design a non-democratic regime, and most likely you'd want it to be a strong regime, you want it to be capable and stable, what kind of regime would you advocate for? Okay, here we go. We're going to go through a list of different types. Regime type 1, monarchy. Now this is a truly ancient form. So ancient, you might think it as a sort of preternaturally human form of political order. And okay, we often talk about monarchy as absolutist in relation to kings and queens, but even the strongest monarchs still have to share power in one way or another. Because no one, and I mean no one, has the superhuman power to get millions of people to always do what they say just because they say it. Any leader needs their henchmen, and those henchmen, if they're going to do the king's dirty work consistently at least, they're going to want some power and privilege in return for that loyalty. Now, in the case of monarchy, much of the shared power will stay within the extended family of the monarch himself, usually a bloodline tied to the king, and from which most princes and noblemen are going to stem. They're all going to get a piece of the power pie as long as they stay loyal to you as a king, and they'll be killed otherwise. But you still need to control your population. In all authoritarian regimes, population control is going to come in 2 forms, what you might call 1, soft power, and 2, hard power. The soft power is what propaganda is for. You need to convince your people that you are their legitimate ruler. Maybe you have a divine right to rule. God himself might have anointed you. Probably you will also claim that you come from a long line of rulers and l'état c'est moi. You are the state. The state is you. There's no country without you. No one else can make that claim. And to drive in this point, of course, you're going to have to partake in a lot of pomp and circumstance. A lot of regular over-the-top ceremonializing of just about everything that you and your family does so that you can internalize this idea among your public that you are different from them. You're higher than them. You have a legitimate right and even a moral obligation to rule over them, to take care of them, of course. And naturally, you'll need hard power too, for when that soft power fails to dissuade people from conspiring against your rule. Here, I'm referring to straight up repression. In monarchies, this is often a spectacle. It's not just about ridding your land of the people who are against you, it's about making an example of them too. Now, if you ever want to get really gnarly details about the kinds of torture-filled executions that kings used to perform in public, especially in Europe, well, just read the first chapter of Michel Foucault's seminal masterpiece, Discipline and Punishment. It's absolutely disgusting. But the point is, you'll need to regularly remind people that you are equal to God. You're equal to God's wrath. Now, there's still quite a few kingdoms out there in the world today. But more or less since the French Revolution in 1789, the era of monarchical power has mostly given way to the idea that legitimacy of the state lies not in divine rights to rule, but in the so-called will of the people. Recall Jean-Jacques Rousseau and his conceptualization of the social contract. This transition did, of course, lead to the rise of modern democracy, but did not require democratic government per se. Instead, it meant that rulers, from then on out, simply had to come up with a legitimizing narrative that interpreted their rule as representing the will of the people. the nation, etc. As you recall from last week, Napoleon Bonaparte spearheaded this transition like no other. Born the son of an indigent royalty in Corsica, he bypassed monarchical tradition altogether, and in 1804 crowned himself Emperor of France, claiming that his right to rule came not from God, but from the French people themselves. Now, the most interesting of the non-monarchical authoritarian regimes, however, emerged much later in the 20th century, also known as the century of mass politics. And this is when common people like you and me were lulled into becoming active participants in national politics for the very first time in history. There are some of my favorite authoritarian regimes here, and honestly, I'd like to hear about your favorites too, even though nobody likes authoritarianism. Number one, the one-party state. It has a couple different forms, which vary by degree and population control mainly, but let's focus on my fave, exemplified best by Mexico during the period 1929 to 2000. At that time, Mexico was ruled by El Partido Revolucionario Institucional, the PRI, and it relied far more on soft power than brute force repression. For starters, it propagandized a great legitimizing narrative that the state was in fact a revolution institutionalized, which is totally an oxymoron, but nonetheless a highly effective mythology to cull popular support. And second, it banned most private unions and other organizations, but it created massive state-controlled unions to supposedly represent everyone from industrial workers to farmers to teachers to doctors and tradesmen. This is called corporatism. And then, of course, it blocked all other political parties from freely competing in national elections, although it still held regular national elections, which had the benefit of convincing a great number of people that they were actually living in a democracy. So this regime lasted 71 years, and that is a good run. Of course, the PRI in Mexico also relied on coercion and repression, but unlike the kings of the past, most of this was hidden from public view. And like most authoritarian regimes of the 20th century, the PRI's one-party state got really good at simply making political rivals disappear out of the public view. And a quick note about disappear, this word became a transitive verb only since the 1960s. This is when authoritarian governments worldwide, but especially Latin America, made it a state policy to disappear people rather than to put them on trial or execute them publicly. It's a bit freaky, I know. But anyways, speaking of disappearing people, let's jump to my next favorite authoritarian regime type, the military junta. The junta came into vogue in the 1960s and was very much a phenomenon of the Cold War. These regimes usually followed military coups and were characterized by a power-sharing arrangement between the various branches of the military, Army, Navy, Marines, blah, 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 often in alliance with the Catholic Church or other religious organizations, as well as various sectors of the national economy. And their legitimizing narrative usually was anti-communist to the core. Often their leadership would describe their regime as being a temporary stopgap measure that was necessary to save Western civilization and Christianity itself from communism and from atheism and all those terrible things. But of course they used hard power too because they were the military, and many of them end up being extremely violent in the repression of political dissent. They also tended to look a lot like Darth Vader in Star Wars, although most likely Star Wars was inspired by them first. So anyways, in general, military juntas were not super stable, partly because they rarely propagated their rule as a permanent thing, but instead a sort of corrective measure to prepare the nation for a democratic future. But let's look at my other favorite regime, which often starts as a military junta, but then transitions into what we call a personalistic dictatorship. These regimes can come and go pretty quickly. They can be very unstable, but many have been surprisingly long-lasting, often lasting until the death of the old man himself. My all-time favorite example of an old man like this is Robert Mugabe from Zimbabwe. He ruled since 1980, when the country became independent, until his death in 2019. And although Mugabe's state was absolutely terrible, he was able to establish a small power-sharing arrangement with family and party loyalists who, by keeping the country so poor and divided that no one could contest his power, he stayed in power for that long. It's just brilliant. Okay, authoritarian regime number 4, theocracy. Think of one. Iran. That's the first one I can think about. It's been a theocratic state since the revolution in 1979, governed by a system of clerical authority and Islamic law that, while still managing regular elections, restricts democratic freedoms to that which is consistent with the ideological vision of their religious elite. Now, power is shared between the clergy and some sectors of the military establishment, specifically the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or the IRGC, and the population is controlled by a mix of repression, which, as we saw in February of this year, can get really bad. And a lot of propaganda mythologizing the Islamic Republic's existential contest against the West, against Israel, and all of that too. And finally, your all-time favorite regime type, number 5, the totalitarian regime. Named as such because in these cases the state seeks not only to rule over its people without accountability, but also to directly control all aspects of human social, economic, and political life. Creepy, I know. Now, you can probably include some fascist regimes here, like those of Mussolini and Adolf Hitler, but the truth is that neither of those bastards could ever match the likes of people like Joseph Stalin and his Soviet Union, Mao Zedong's China, or the Kim dynasty in North Korea. And why? Well, in the words of a Cuban refugee I met in Spain long ago, total control by the state is only really possible where the state has abolished private property. For in the moment, every single person in the country becomes wholly dependent on the state for their livelihood and their survival, which means that no one can protest, no one can resist, well, if they don't want to starve to death right away. So if you want to be a totalitarian, you need to make sure there are no free markets, no black markets, and no organizations of any kind that are independent of state control. Everyone must rely on you, the state, for their shelter, their water, their work, and their daily bread. And then you can tell them that 2 + 2 = 5, and they'll have no other choice but to deeply believe it. Of course, soft power helps too, and with totalitarian regimes, the notorious cult of personality is one of the most common strategies of leader legitimization. The main thing to do if you are a leader is to make your people really believe you are some form of God. And you do this by having them worship your image constantly, everywhere, in their homes, in their kitchens, in their bedrooms, in their gardens. And anyone who doesn't have the leader's portrait hanging over their bed frame, well, yeah, you know what I mean. So now you know, just like there are a lot of different ways to do democracy, there are also a lot of different ways to do authoritarianism. And maybe they all kind of suck. But if you had to live with one form of authoritarianism, I want to ask you, which would you choose? If you could choose, which of course you couldn't because it's authoritarianism. But I'd still like to know. I'm looking forward to hearing from you. I'm Professor Michael Wolff, and this is Comparative Politics.